We've sort of moved past the token is scary time of the market and thinking, well, actually, this might be a thing that it makes markets more efficient.
You're also seeing this phase now where lots of different firms and regulated groups now have licenses.
We're going to see a lot of progress in a short period of time. There's a challenge for the regulators, certainly, to get comfortable with that level of trust in a trustless system.
I mean, how do you think they're going to come in and do that? Where are they going to focus?
Hello, and welcome to the LathamTECH Podcast, where we survey the latest trends emerging from the world of tech and explore their impacts on your company, both the opportunities and the risks. I'm Zach Fallon, Global Co-Chair of Latham's Digital Asset and Web3 Practice, and joining me today is my fellow Global Co-Chair and Latham partner, Gabe Lakeman. Gabe helps clients navigate the shifting regulatory landscape of digital assets, payment services, and technology. Welcome, Gabe.
Great to be here, Zach.
So in this episode, Gabe and I are going to explore tokenization and the regulatory and business distinctions across the Atlantic between the US and the UK and the EU. Gabe, there's been a lot of talk about tokenization lately. How would you describe it? How would you define tokenization? What is it in your mind?
Yeah, so I think at its core, I'd define tokenization as the use of blockchain technology to represent an asset or right. And in the context we're going to be talking about, that's use of blockchain technology to represent a financial instrument like a share. And I think just to kind of add an additional distinction on that will be helpful for this conversation, you can distinguish between native and non-native forms of tokenized financial instruments or tokenized shares. And that's where on a native tokenization, you have a token actually constituting or being the share, whereas on a non-native form of tokenization, you have a token that in some way represents a share without constituting that share itself.
Right, almost like perhaps a derivative of some
sort.
sort.
Various kinds of structures.
And so when we're talking about tokenization, is this new in the EU, in the UK, or what is the regulatory approach? How are regulators thinking about tokenization as it relates to these types of assets?
So I think it's something where there was a lot of attention on it some time ago in the kind of last 4 or 5 years, but not really much movement.
Right.
And it's only now that we're getting to the stage where the opportunity is really starting to present itself. Firms are really moving into the space. Regulators have now set out full-blown regulatory regimes that cover traditional financial services and crypto assets and make clear where the borders between those regimes lie. And so we're now at the position where we're seeing a lot of firms, a lot of clients really starting to try and move into the space. And so far, that's focusing on, I'd say, non-native forms of tokenized financial instrument. So we've seen various forms of complex and innovative structures people have used to have a token that represents typically shares or some other instrument, often held with a custodian or with an SPV, and then layering on some form of derivative or certificate structure to pass through the exposure to that share to token holders.
Yeah, I think what's nice is that we've sort of moved past the token is scary, token is stay away from token type time of the market and thinking about, well, actually, this might be a thing that it makes markets more efficient. And in so doing, finding a way to tokenize traditional financial assets can be quite exciting. And I think that's why folks are dialing in and tuning in on this issue.
Yeah, and I guess to add to that, you're also seeing this phase now where lots of different firms and regulated groups now have licenses, both in the TradFi and in the crypto space. We've got the development of a mature ecosystem of service providers also in the space. So people are now familiar with the technology. They're familiar with the types of asset they're looking to tokenize, and it just becomes a much more realistic prospect.
Yeah, it's a much more natural evolution of the space. Very exciting. And I would say, in the US, we are similarly. People have been talking about tokenization for a number of years, but there hasn't been a lot of adoption. And to the extent that folks have adopted tokenization of traditional real-world assets, in many ways, just frankly, securities, it's been a bit of a road to nowhere. There hasn't really been a place in which you can trade and transact in these assets. So, tokenizing a thing isn't necessarily novel. It's just the form at which the security takes a token, maybe 50 years ago was a paper certificate. So in that sense, it's nothing necessarily novel other than the technology and the ability for folks to essentially hold these assets in their own self-custodial wallets and potentially interact with each other peer-to-peer, which I think is quite exciting.
Yeah. I mean, I think the interesting thing there is, I mean, some of those structures that people are adopting now, things like certificate structures, they've got a lot in common with structures like depository receipt programs and so on that, again, people have been familiar with for decades.
Right.
But now just because you're doing it with a token doesn't really change anything in the legal characterization of that structure. The bit that's more interesting and where there's more challenges are where people are trying to do native tokenized financial instruments, native tokenized equity. And that's where you do start to see some more challenges.
What would those challenges be?
Yeah, so in the EU and in the UK, there are kind of hard legislative blockers on certain forms of tokenized equity. So when a financial instrument is traded on a trading venue in the EU, there are requirements for that instrument to be recorded on the books and records of a central securities depository, a form of sort of TradFi financial markets infrastructure that would be recording securities through some book entry system, which is inconsistent with the use of a public blockchain to act as the ledger recording everybody's kind of share interests. And so those kind of structures do create some blockers for firms looking to move into the space.
It's interesting, though, that the CSD would be incompatible. You're saying it's be incompatible with blockchain natively? Just the way in which they operate, or just the fact that it's two separate systems of accounting?
It's really that it needs to use a private ledger because it needs to have, not necessarily a private ledger, but it needs to have a certain level of control over the way in which it's recording those securities, which is challenging if you're trying to use a public ledger, which is obviously where the promise of a lot of this technology lies.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the U.S., certainly there was uncertainty at the federal level as to whether or not entities like registered transfer agents could rely on blockchain technology to serve as master security holder files for their books and records. And earlier this summer, there was some guidance that came out from the Division of Trading Markets, which essentially said that's okay. I mean, you can use distributed ledger technology to maintain your books and records as a registered transfer agent, and you could have offline information that supplements that, like names and addresses of folks. So in that sense, it seems entirely compatible. And I think on the U.S. side, it's just been a hesitance to embrace the technology generally in the last handful of years. And so I think that those barnacles being scraped off the boat, so to speak, and I think we're going to see a lot of progress in a short period of time.
So where do you see that coming from? Do you see the US as being the first mover into this new era of fully native tokenized shares?
Well, I mean, folks have already issued tokenized equities, and we had the first listed Class A common stock a few weeks back that was listed that was made available for sale in tokenized form. And I think that is, again, is not necessarily anything novel because it's just the form at which the security takes. But I think the hard part has been, which I think is probably not too dissimilar from what you were describing before, is the idea that how are intermediaries going to touch and be able to intermediate these things in their using traditional rules, using the old rules that don't necessarily gel or graph too cleanly, and there's a lot of uncertainty. There needs to be guidance, and I think that's so. If we're a first mover, it will only be because we have that guidance. But the one thing we do know is that the SEC here in the U.S. has suggested that crypto market structure would be part of the regulatory agenda over the the coming years, and so I think in that sense they're going to be putting out some guidance, certainly in the form of proposed rules that will then have to be people can comment on, and they can tweak them based on those comments and get eventual rules in place.
Yeah, that's super interesting because I think certainly in the UK and the EU, we're still seeing regulators being, I think, to some extent, quite silent on how this is going to develop when we start seeing more and more forms of tokenized shares and tokenized financial instruments.
How would you say the EU, the UK, how are they looking to make tokenization viable? What's their approach going to be in the end of the day? I
mean, we've seen sort of some interest from regulators on it. We've seen various sort of regulatory sandboxes and pilot programs that the regulators have brought out to facilitate looking at some of those sort of legislative and hard regulatory blockers to certain forms of trading of tokenized equity. Those so far, I think, haven't been that successful. It's fair to say, and so I think we're still in a phase where to some extent, it feels a bit like there's a wait and see approach being taken. I mean, my expectation is that, building on what you've said, we will see, major US listed entities with tokenized, issuing tokenized shares, and at some stage, then there's a question of how do they get into the hands of people in the UK and the EU. And once that happens, you can then see that the regulatory attention to the space, I think, will start to increase
that
a lot.
Makes a lot of sense, which is different than sort of the non-native types of tokenization you were talking about before, where you end up. So the irony is those products are being offered, they seem to be anyway, in the EU. We're starting to come out in certain forms, but they're relating to U.S.-based companies, and I think there's some tension point. And I think folks are sort of identifying that as yet another reason why U.S. regulators should act to kind of avoid that outcome, if you will.
Yeah, and I think one of the really interesting things with this technology is, I mean, one of the promises is the way it offers the ability to kind of disintermediate financial markets. If you have native tokenized equity, you can hold that in your non-custodial wallet on an app on your phone. You're not having to deal with a regulated custodian holding it for you. You can transfer it on a peer-to-peer basis. So the opportunities there to really get so much more efficiency in the way markets operate are incredible. But at the same time, traditionally, regulators, when they regulate an area, are looking at the intermediaries and putting the regulation on the intermediaries.
Right.
And that's just in basic tension with a disintermediated approach.
The goal is almost to go find the intermediary, even if there isn't one necessarily. And so I think there's a challenge for regulators certainly to get comfortable with that level of trust in a trustless system, which is essentially what we're talking about.
Yeah, and then, I mean, how do you think they're going to come in and do that? Where are they going to focus?
We've seen it in the past, right? The internet is not regulated, at least not by securities regulators anyway. And I think so that we've certainly had them get comfortable in the past in the face of innovation, and I think they'll get there again. It's a question at what prodding and how much prompting and prodding is required to get them there. But I think at the end of the day, folks, the more they live and are able to play with these technologies, will understand essentially that at their core, the goal of them, and not necessarily always successful, right? But the goal of them is to be disintermediated, to be passive automated tools that folks can deploy at their own will, and they don't necessarily, that type of intermediation, if it is intermediation, which I suppose it is one form of it, may not be the kind that ultimately should be regulated by the securities regulators, or if it is, it should be a fairly light touch, just given the way the technology works.
Yeah, I mean, and we're seeing it already in the EU, regulatory guidance coming out on firms seeking to integrate some of these sort of non-custodial wallet apps typically within a retail app and have that boundary between the kind of self-custody, disintermediated service versus the kind of regulated service.
Right.
And there's a lot of questions about how you can do those within the same or within a similar environment, what the regulatory expectations are on that. But at the moment, it does seem like there is a path forward for doing that. And so I think we will see increasing adoption of some of these non-custodial wallet apps, increasing use of them.
Right.
And then once the tokenized equity then flows in, it will just be really interesting.
For me, the exciting part is the composability of these chains and the technology, the smart contracts, and the ability to take tokenized equities and perhaps find other instruments, and then to get access to other things, and back to the self-custodial nature of these things, the idea that where historically your brokers are out lending your securities, well, you might be able to do that yourself, and then you build from there, right? Of course, you can build regulatory frameworks on top of that, and we're talking about sort of the tail of things. The vast majority of folks will continue to live in TradFi rails, and I think that's perfectly fine. And we need an approach that facilitates that in a measured way, but we shouldn't presume that that's the case in every instance, and so we should build into it, I think. So, Gabe, looking ahead, what are the trends you see? You foresee as it relates to tokenization? What's your crystal ball showing you?
I mean, I think we'll see a kind of wave of adoption and use as some of these structures, particularly in the US, get more established and bedded down. And so we'll start to see more adoption, people holding tokenized equity or other forms of instrument in their sort of self-custodial, non-custodial wallets. I think we'll also see firms and service providers, continuing to navigate the kind of regulatory perimeter, the kind of area between the sort of regulated TradFi services and some of these new and innovative ways of providing services that don't chip into those requirements.
Right. I mean, I think that's a very interesting point, because I think you're seeing that already, where this collision of different asset classes, securities and commodities, and in the U.S. certainly you're seeing that type of the regulators sort of finally responding to that kind of what has been obvious to everyone for a number of years now, and saying, providing guidance around whether, for instance, traditional securities intermediaries can interact with spot commodities markets, and how do those two things interact, and stating what makes perfect sense, a reasonable position to say that it's not per se prohibited, but of course still we may need some guidance as to how that actually works if we want robust adoption. So I think one thing I do foresee is certainly more engagement with regulators on how they can get that right, how they can get that appropriately tailored for purposes of the frameworks. And so I think I definitely engagement first with regulators to get the right rules adopted, and then to your point, off to the races. The other thing, I guess one point I would say, crypto generally, as you know, being in space for a while, they're always pushing the boundaries. And so I think, where whatever guidance comes out and wherever it lands, there will be other things developing on the fringe of that at any given moment, because it's just the nature of things in the space. It's a super exciting times.
Yeah,
too.
I mean, it is fascinating in the way in which this area we'll see a product roll out. We'll see things get into the hands of consumers, and then the regulatory regimes to some extent following that activity, which I don't think is always a bad thing. I mean, going back to it, it's good regulation is responsive to issues that are identified in the market.
Right.
You can get, rather than sort of running ahead and trying to be prescriptive as to how
Exactly.
activity should happen. And I think that trend will carry on with tokenization.
I mean, one of the benefits of there not necessarily being a regulatory framework in place right now is that but for that last handful of years where everything was a problem, in the absence of guidance, now we can sort of move to a place where we have guidance with a number of years of experience, which is a better place to ultimately adopt rules when you have the experience with the technology. And I think the general approach of common sense regulation is, as you said, reacting to the issues that come up and not necessarily putting the kibosh on things just because it's unfamiliar.
I always say people knew what a share was for about 300 years before we had securities regulation and MiFID. Whereas with crypto, we've seen lots of rules coming out somewhat preemptively, and I absolutely agree that often you end up with better law and better regulation when it follows the activity and reflects what we've learned about it in the meantime.
Yeah, let's hope it doesn't take 300 years, but it has been nice to have some time to season in the space for sure. I think that's a great place for us to wrap, though, on our discussion of tokenization and the approaches on both sides of the Atlantic. Please be sure to join us for our second part in the two-part miniseries where we talk about stablecoins. Gabe, thank you for joining me.
Great to be here.
And thank you for tuning in to this episode of LathamTECH Podcast. We hope you will join us next time.
You can subscribe and watch or listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like more information about the topics in this podcast, please email us from the links located in the show description.